Ray, welcome to the Sipping Point.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Laurie. We're looking forward to it.
I'm excited. I haven't seen you in a while, and so it's great to virtually be with you and talk about your new book, The World in a
Yes.
Wineglass, and hear all about that. But I always love to start my show, and I get to talk to so many amazing people in wine. Just hearing the story about what lit the spark for you, that wine was going to be your career, or even took you to that path, because we all have different crazy stories that bring us to wine. So I don't, even though I've known you for many years, I don't know if I know that story for you, and I'd love to hear it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I did not grow up with wine. I grew up in Texas. I mean, it's not like I grew up on a farm. My dad was a professor, but we there's not really a wine drinking household. I think it was a Budweiser and later Coors drinking household. But I got into wine. I basically was in grad school in Boston in literature, and my girlfriend at the time worked was a grad student, but worked at, as one does, at restaurants, and she worked at a high end restaurant. And she was kind of into wine as a result, so we started having wine with dinner. And I was like, "Oh, this stuff's good. I really kind of like this." And and sort of that developed into like buying the Hugh Johnson guide, the pocket guide, and sort of going to wine stores and kind of looking to see what was in there that I could find and afford on my ridiculous grad school budget. It's like, burrito or wine, which am I going to do here? And then all of that would have probably just resulted in me being a guy who liked wine, except that I got a grad fellowship in the Bay Area, and I started going to wineries, and I started buying wine more consciously. And a guy at K&L Wines, actually in Redwood City, told me that occasionally wineries needed small, very small wineries needed help with bottlings because they bring the bottling truck around and they bring people in for the weekend and they pay you in wine, and like being paid in $60 bottles of Cabernet sounded like a pretty good gig to me. So I started doing that. And then I started helping out at wineries more often. And then I turned my teaching schedule around to where I could work harvest and then teach the rest of the year. And then I was like, you know what? I hate academia and I really like wine. So I didn't know exactly at that point what I was going to do. And for a variety of reasons, I ended up moving to New York to be with my girlfriend, now wife, who didn't see any particular reason being employed to move to California to be with unemployed, maybe wine guy. It's a hard sell. So I moved to New York, and it's sort of simultaneously I got a job selling port for 1,000 grams port for the Symington family, and that I knew I wanted to write, and I knew I wanted to be in wine. I didn't know that I would get the two together. And so I hauled a bag of port around New York, which is its own strange experience, and wrote freelance on
I
the side. And then
bet.
Josh Green at Wine and Spirits read something I'd written, and we started talking about me freelancing, and pretty soon he offered me an editorial job. And I was at Wine and Spirits for a few years. Then I moved to Food and Wine. I've been at Food and Wine ever since. So weird combo platter of always wanting to
Yeah.
write, then finding apparently the subject I was supposed to write about, which I never ever would have guessed was wine, and then being in the right place at the right time to make that happen. And then I've been
Oh, that's a
lucky enough
great,
to be at Food and Wine for a long time since then.
that's wonderful. And you've just came out with your book, and I
Yep.
have been really impressed getting through it, The World in a Wineglass. And
Yeah.
what was the inspiration? Because obviously you've been writing about wine for so long, but this book in particular, which I think is such a great book to really help people through a journey of the world through
Yeah.
wines that you suggest. And you really set it up perfectly in the beginning too, and we'll talk about that. But what was the inspiration to write this book?
The inspiration was kind of dual. I mean, I've always been interested in environmental issues as well as wine, and that was something my father actually was interested in, and so that's been an ongoing thing. So I've always been interested in that nexus of sustainability, organics, biodynamics, et cetera, in the context of wine. And I felt there wasn't a book out there that kind of looked at wines or was a guide to wines that were essentially, not industrial, not commercialized in a kind of marketing strategy way, that were made in a way that valued the planet and was trying to do something good about it. So it's sort of like, I think David Hirsch, actually from Hirsch Vineyards, kind of phrased it in my interview, real wines made by real people from a real place, with that additional angle thrown in of being earth eco-friendly or whatever you want to say. And I couldn't find the book I wanted to read about it, so I figured the best thing to do was write it. And then I didn't
Mhm.
intend for it to be 700 pages long. It just it just got longer and longer. And part of it was finding wineries that I hadn't planned to write about because I was told about them by other wineries, as I was doing interviews for it. So it grew in the making, I guess you'd say. But I really, I think there's a lot of wine out there that's perfectly drinkable and perfectly nice, but doesn't really speak of a place or is made in the millions of cases. I wanted to focus on the kind of, you know, really visionary producers who were making something they deeply cared about and that expressed that.
I love that. Sometimes when people in our business talk about these type of wines versus commercial wines, it can come off snobbery or this or that. But I
Yeah,
love the way you set it up in the book and you really explain the difference between a commercial, more bulk wine producer versus a producer who really had their hands in the process and cares about every bottle that's going out. And some of them
yeah,
can be large producers, but it's a different mindset. It's a different type of experience.
yeah. I mean, big doesn't mean bad, and small doesn't mean good. There are plenty of small producers who are, in fact, not very good, and there are plenty of small producers who just blast their vineyards with chemicals, and there are some very large producers that work, I mean, who work biodynamically or at the very least organically. So it's not a you can't make that assumption, which I didn't want to do, and I also didn't, a whole part of my big part of my career has been making wine approachable and not pretentious and not snobby, and at baseline it's fermented grape juice that provides joy to people. So it doesn't need that kind of gatekeeping, and I wanted to get at that, and that's a lot of the reason why the profiles in the book are really interview driven, and they're really about people saying what they're doing in their own voice, why they're working the way they do, because I think the human aspect is really a part that matters a lot, and also what makes the wine approachable. It's we can write about 6 inches of calcareous soil all you want, but hearing someone in their own words talk about why they've switched to organic practices because of the river that they grew up next to being filled with garbage, it just has a more of an
Yes.
effect.
Love that at least in the book you have given people a guide by country and
Mhm.
sub-region to go through and taste wines that you feel really reflect the place and have something to say, a story to tell, if you will. But before that, one of the things I love is how you set up what is sustainability versus organic versus
Right.
biodynamic, because I think that is very confusing to a lot of wine drinkers, wine lovers, maybe even people that are in the wine industry, because it's not like you can just pick up a bottle and look one place to know. Could
It
you
is
I thought it
baffling.
was perfect in the book. Could you
Thank you.
if folks don't understand those three terms, maybe just in a summary way, how do you distinguish between those three?
Yeah, so sustainability, it is confusing. It's very confusing. It's particularly confusing because of how wine is labeled and so on, and because there's so many regulatory agencies and so many different sustainability platforms and organic platforms and so on. But the short version, that sustainability, which comes from the word sustain, means working in a way that sustains the environmental, health of your property, and also importantly is sustains the kind of worker well-being and broader energy well-being. So it incorporates things like not ideally not using chemical pesticides and so on, treating workers well, doing things like salmon safe approaches to vineyards so that runoff doesn't kill all the salmon in the local stream, to using green practices like solar power and so on. And so it's a kind of a broad catch-all term that's unfortunately very easily abused. It's like, I put an
Mhm.
owl box in my vineyard, therefore I'm farming sustainably. And I do talk about in the book how it's probably, of those terms, the one that gets bandied around the most, and the most kind of like where you run into what they term greenwashing. But when done well, sustainability is very important. Organics is more specifically a farming approach that uses non-systemic chemicals. It doesn't use systemic chemical fertilizers or pesticides to treat problems in the vineyard. So if you have, mold or mildew or bugs or whatever, you use organic treatments rather than using chemical, malathion or whatever, approaches that, you find in so much commercial farming. And And so that's a very specific approach. It's an organic way of dealing with problems in the vineyard. It doesn't necessarily reach out to those other kind of societal things. Biodynamics is controversial. It's comes from the teachings or writings of a very odd Austrian named Rudolf Steiner back in the turn of the 19th, 20th century era. His big idea, which was a very good idea, was that you treat the farm, and he was really talking about farming as a whole, as one entire organic um, system. And so when you're working biodynamically, you're not talking about just the plant that's in the ground, but you're talking about the atmosphere around it, the birds, the bees, the microbes in the soil, everything, the light coming from the sun, everything it works as an organic whole. And so you try and treat the vineyard as a living organism, and it typically involves kind of beyond organic preparations. There are a bunch of biodynamic preparations. It does take a kind of a spiritual leap, I guess, if you're practicing true biodynamics. That's a little kooky sometimes because there's a lot of astrologically related things. Even I think my favorite quote in the book about biodynamics is Olivier Hombrecht from Zin Hombrecht, who's a master of wine, who's a master's in viticulture, but a guy scientifically trained. He's brilliant. He said when he started out, he created a manure pile, one of which was sort of using just whatever, conventionally farmed stuff, one of which was using organically farmed materials, and one was using biodynamically farmed materials. And he went to a lab and tested the microbial life in each pile, and the biodynamic one was off the charts. And he said, as a scientist, part of science is trying to figure out why. But if I can measure it, I know that something is happening. And the fact that the
Mm,
biodynamics, for reasons I don't understand yet, is creating more microbial life in the soil, that says something to me about the efficacy of it. And I thought that was quite, to the point, because there's a lot of biodynamics that makes you kind of go like, I don't know, it sounds a little strange.
exactly.
um,
Yeah.
and then regenerative farming kind of takes the best parts of sustainability and the best parts of organics and puts them together. And it is regenerative in that a big part of it is the idea of the soil is a living, you're again looking at carbon sequestration in the soil, and you're looking at microbial life in the soil. And another quote from the book is, a winemaker said to me, when we're walking on the soil, we were on the surface of the earth, but we're really walking on the ceiling of a kingdom of billions of organisms. And if you use conventional treatments, you're basically murdering billions of people in their little kingdom, and
Oh,
which is kind of like a
wow.
little bit alarming, but dead
Yeah.
soil is dead soil. There's no
Right.
microbial life in it. And if you want terroir and you want expression of a place, you are better off living in soil. So that was my super quick,
Yes.
analysis
No,
of
I
those
love
things,
that because I
four
think
things.
it is confusing. And the other thing you talk about that I think no matter how many times we tell people that sulfites are not responsible for their wine headaches, it still does not get through, I feel like, to the wine drinking public. And there's also a run through that a lot of people will ask me, is it true that European wines have no sulfites, but American
Right.
wines just have tons of sulfites? And that's why I get a headache from them. And in Europe, I can drink like 2 bottles of wine and I feel great. But when I'm at home, it doesn't happen. So you talked a little bit about the sulfite,
Yeah.
discrepancies between different organic, certifying
I mean, if
bodies,
you
et cetera.
Yeah, the sulfite thing is become a kind of a bugbear for people who like anybody who has a problem when they drink consume its sulfites. It's odd because it's if you have a sulfite, if you have a legitimately have a sulfite allergy, first you probably won't get a headache. You'll probably get a constriction in your throat. Like sort of, this is why asthmatics actually have to really worry about sulfite stuff. And you'll probably get it from frozen broccoli faster than you get it from wine,
Right.
or certainly dried apricots if they're the orange kind. If they're brown and they look like someone scraped them off the bottom of a shoe, then they haven't been sulfited. If they're bright orange, they've been sulfited like crazy. And and so there's a lot of misinformation floating around, and it's a pity. I mean, the truth is European wines have sulfites. American wines have sulfites. Sulfites, to some degree, are naturally occurring as a product of fermentation. I say in the book, realistically, people go to Europe. They're like, I had wonderful. I had wine. I didn't have a headache. I was fine. It's because guess what? You're on a trip to Italy and you're on vacation and you're you're having the
Yes.
time of your life. Usually, you feel good. You get back
Mhm.
home, you feel like hell. And what they found is that headaches are probably tied to different compounds that are naturally occurring in the skins of grapes, particularly red grapes. The other thing about headaches is if people always say red wines give me headaches, and people do get red wine headaches, but it's not sulfites because if you've got headaches from sulfites, you'd be much more likely to get them from white wine, which tends to be
Mhm.
have a
Has
higher sulfite
more.
thing because
Yeah.
it prevents browning. It's why people used to spray sulfites on salad bars. Keep all the lettuce turning brown. So
Yes.
there's a lot of misinformation out around wine. The other one, there's a stat recently that a wildly surprising number of people, drinkers in the US, think that wine has sugar in it, all wine, and it's all packed full of sugar. And you're like, dry wine does not have sugar.
Right.
Yes, there's sugar in grapes, but it's converted to alcohol, and so it's a constant battle against kind of misinformation. But that's true for a lot of life at the moment.
Yeah, that's true. When I used to work at Astor Wines back in the day when I
Yeah,
was first studying wine, and people
I
would come
used to
in
sell wine to
and
Astor Wines back in the day.
oh, maybe we even crossed paths. I wasn't a
Maybe
buyer though,
so.
but you may have been in the store. But people would say,
Yeah,
"I'm looking for a sweet wine." But what
yeah,
they didn't mean a dessert wine. What they really meant was a fruity wine.
right.
And this whole idea of, yes, it's got lots of fruit, even like reds can be jammy, which jam is sweet, but we mean
Yeah,
jammy, like concentrated fruit flavors. And so there's a easy way to mix those things up. Sugar is like the real sweetness left over in the wine that doesn't
yeah.
get converted to alcohol. And that's typically not the dry table wines that we're talking
No,
about, and drinking. And so yeah, that
and
that can be
biologically,
challenging.
and based on evolution and everything. I mean, our bodies are primed to think that ripe fruit flavors are associated with sweetness because the riper a fruit is, the more sugars there are in the fruit. So when you taste
Right.
a wine that's got really rich, dark, ripe flavors, your brain is kind of saying, "Well, this is ripe fruit, therefore sweet," even if it's a dry
Yes.
wine. It's one of those odd things. Brains play all sorts of tricks, and that's one of them. So
What are
it's
your this is a question that just popped in my head, but what are your thoughts about labeling for wine? There are a couple hundred compounds that in the US you are allowed to add to wine that you would not get away with in other places like Europe and other wine
yeah,
regions. And so I battle with the idea of I would like to know that. And if we had wine labeling, which is exactly what's in your wine. If it's just grapes and yeast, and that's
right.
fermentation, and maybe a little bit of sulfites to preserve, that sounds fabulous to me as far as the things listed on the back. Or if a winemaker does have a Pinot Noir with some residual sugar, wouldn't it be nice
Right.
to know that on the bottle that, yes, there actually is a little bit of sugar in this red wine that you might not get otherwise? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's an interesting question, obviously. I mean, the wine foodstuffs are regulated by the FDA. Wine is not. It's just the TTV or whatever. And so there is no, you have to put alcohol level, but you don't have to put ingredients. On the other hand, what's in the wine in the bottle is not necessarily what went into the wine when you were making it. So for instance, if you know, people use Velcorin, which is a sterilant. It's used in the fruit juice business. If you're doing commercial fruit juice, you tend to use Velcorin because it kills off any bacteria. In wine, it's if you're making really ripe wines or really mass produced wines or whatever, it's a way of ensuring that there won't be if you have like a little tiny bit of residual sugar. Well, if you also have a little bit of tiny residual yeast, you've got a secondary fermentation that happens. So you zap it with Velcorin. It eradicates anything living in the wine. You have to have a hazmat suit to use it, and you have to like stay away from the wine for 48 hours because it breaks down into CO2 and water. But it's not in it. It's not in the wine.
Hmm.
So would you label it? You won't label it as saying it's got Velcro in it because it had Velcro in it to kill you. But it was used. That's not an
Yeah.
ingredient, that's a
Interesting.
practice, and at the same time, it's like and winemakers are somewhat justifiably wary about saying, the wine has SO2 in it. People are like, "What's SO2?" And it's like, "Well, it's sulfites." And it's like, wine does actually have to say it has sulfites, but it would be nice to know if the wine has been zapped with mega purple, but mega purple is just concentrated grape juice, so you could just say it has grape juice in it. So it's a funny question
Mm,
that I haven't made up my own mind about.
yeah.
I like I like places like Ridge that do say, "This is what's in the wine, and this is it." You know?
Mhm.
and it's a voluntary thing, and I like that. But until there's no regulatory agency for it at the moment. So it's a very puzzling question.
The reason I was thinking about it is I had interviewed someone who was making non-alcoholic wine, and the minute
Mhm.
you de-alcoholize the wine,
Yes.
now they do have to put the nutritional information on there as far as the calories and all of that. But when it's wine, you don't need to. And I just was like, this is so interesting because all
It's
of a
very
sudden, without
interesting.
alcohol, you have to do certain things. But when it has alcohol, we don't have that information.
And it's also interesting that when you do a de-alcoholized non-alcoholic wine, it's actually a much more industrial process than than simply making wine is. So you're already
Hmm.
looking at a much more manipulated product. And second, with a lot of them, they've got additional preservatives because you don't have alcohol, which is itself a preservative.
Right.
And so I did a non-alcoholic wine roundup not too long ago, and I was checking back labels because I have to put in it. And there's a lot of sodium benzoate or whatever, and you're like, that's odd.
Interesting.
That,
Yeah.
but it's basically fruit juice, and fruit juice goes off if you don't preserve it.
Well, in the book, you kind of set it up for us as far as, the whole sustainability, organic, biodynamic, but also about tasting wine. And I love your sort of no nonsense, way of looking at tasting and kind of like, yes, the tasting notes get crazy. But then what you go into is organizing the book by the various regions.
Right.
If somebody gets the book and they want to really start with 3 regions just to get started to focus on, what would you suggest that they start
Yeah, it's
with?
it's an interesting question. I mean, I called it the world in a wine glass because it does cover as much as I could of the whole world. So it's like everywhere from southern Chile to Lebanon to California to Burgundy, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's a lot of regions to choose from. I would say, you know, I think I would probably read the sections. Well, first, I would say read the sections that you're most interested in yourself because you don't have to read the thing linearly. If you're headed to Tuscany 2 weeks from now, read the Tuscany section,
Mhm.
But I thought in the realm of like storytelling and kind of, what matters to me and kind of like the ones that I found kind of the most affecting to write, I really love the section on Georgia, on the wines of Georgia, because the stories are so. Georgia's a really complicated country that's had a very complicated history, not just the USSR, but like through time. It has a the oldest winemaking tradition, and people there are aware of that. And so I'm very fond of those profiles in that section. I would probably read the Burgundy section because that's kind of the heartland of terroir, and then I might. I might go to Piedmont after that just because I think there's some really wonderful stories in Piedmont too, and I love Barolo. What the hell? But
Me
it's
too.
it's funny. The Burgundy sections. One thing I did with the book is I concentrated on wines that were almost all under $100. And some producers make wines up and down the scale, like Gigal is in there who makes, affordable Cote de Rhone, but makes the Lalas, which are $700 a bottle. But I really concentrated on wines that people could buy. Normal humans could buy, not Elon Musk, It's
Yes.
like
Thank you.
and and so Burgundy's tricky because Burgundy's really expensive right now. And a lot of the kind of great producers that work organically, biodynamically, that are defining producers in Burgundy, the wines are just really too expensive for what I was after. So there's no DRC in the book. There's no Lafleur. But the
Mhm.
Burgundians that I have in there, I think are really great. And, and, a lot of them are in sort of less hallowed parts of Burgundy, but are making spectacular wines. A lot of them are younger too. So,
That's
I guess
awesome.
those three, ask me tomorrow, I'll change my mind. Those three off the top of my head.
And what was there one, maybe that you haven't mentioned region, maybe you researched for the book that you weren't as familiar with, but you're probably semi-familiar with all of them, but that really surprised you or you think would surprise most people?
Yeah, that's an interesting question too. I think Georgia would surprise most people because most people aren't that familiar with the wines of Georgia. I wish I'd
Not
had more
and not
wines.
Georgia, our state, people. The
The wines of the state of Georgia are another question. No, the wines of the country of Georgia. I think, I wish I'd had more producers in the Lebanon section because I think Lebanon is fascinating and obviously it's a very complicated country with a very complicated history.
I brought my
But
Musar.
I love Musar,
as one of the featured Lebanon
and
bottles, and I got to interview Mark Koshar for the show
yeah,
previously, so he's been on
great.
and he's quite impressive. But yes, I
Yeah.
mean, I don't think many people would ever think of Lebanon.
So had interviewed Musar and Domaine de Tourelle, and that was kind of I was a little I wasn't able. I wrote a lot of the book during the pandemic, so I wasn't able to travel quite as much as I'd like.
Okay.
But Domaine Tourelle makes wonderful wines too. So it's a short section, but it's a meaningful section, you know. And then I think probably the Austria section people might not know as many of the producers, and there's so much attention to the environment there, and it there's some really wonderful wineries in there. That's another one that I'm. There are little particular interviews here and there throughout the book that I was kind of thrilled to get. Some places I already knew the story. Some places I didn't know the story, and the story turned out to be amazing. So you know, I kind of go producer by producer in a way.
Yeah, nice. And you get, I mean, with research in the book and just what you do, you get to travel the world quite a bit. What is the craziest thing that's ever happened to you while visiting a winery? Just something
But
just bizarre or very
yeah,
memorable
well,
that's
a
taken place.
couple of things. I mean, I would say the craziest thing that happened to me recently didn't involve wine, it involved tequila because I was down in Guadalajara and I arrived the day before the
Nice.
government decided to, rub out El Mincho, which made the cartel start burning buses and trucks everywhere. And
Oh, Lord.
that was not the plan I had. But that had nothing to do with wine. That just had to do with tequila. I've had number of crazy experiences in wine regions. I mean, a bunch of New Zealand winemakers fairly much shamed me into bungee jumping, which I would not normally do because I'm not insane. But it was they were like, "Ah, you're a wimp, you're scared of bungee jumping." And I was like, "Okay, fine, I'll do it." And it's quite an adrenaline rush if you don't smack into the ground and die. So that was one
Wow.
thing. I had it's not in the book. Gudagao is in the book, but this experience isn't in the book. I had a very funny, not even funny, fascinating trip to Gudagao in Austria this past spring, and it's a they they do a thing for consumers where you show up for 5 days, and it's kind of a deep dive into biodynamics and into their approach to thing. And at one point, um, they asked us to all lie down on the ground and listen to the soil in the vineyard, and it's one of those things where you're like, "Oh my god," it's like, "This is a little too,
Little woo woo.
kind of granola woo woo for me." At the same time, when you've got 12 people all lying on the ground listening to the soil kind of scattered around the vineyard, it does hone your senses in a way, and you start to hear the bugs, and the wind, and you're very free from your phone, and it was honestly was a one of those moments that you go into with vast skepticism and come out thinking that was actually worth doing in a way of focusing your concentration.
All
So I
right.
know those two things. That's in the
I'm heading to Bordeaux in June, so maybe I'll lie in one of the vineyards and see what they think.
yeah. I think if you try that in the Madoc, they'll just think you're totally weird and probably shun you. But
Guilty.
you know, yeah. Who knows?
That's awesome. And, speaking of one of the other things that you talk a little bit about in the book is natural wine, which is such a
Yes.
big hot topic right now. And I either hear from people, that they're totally into it, or I was just interviewing Drew Nieperent of
Yeah.
Nobu and such. And
Not a
he
fan.
said, I'll drink anything, but not natural wine. That was where he
Right.
draws the line. So, what is your stance on natural wine?
So my stance is that the basic idea behind natural wine, which is as little intervention as possible, philosophically makes a lot of sense. The execution doesn't always jibe with the philosophical interest. So there are some natural wines that are just way too funky for me. There are some that I think are brilliant. I think what I tried to address in the book is this kind of artificial divide between the quote unquote natural wine world, which is a kind of a social creation as well as a winemaking approach, because it's very much you're either in the club or you're out of the club. And that bugs me because there are plenty of producers who are not quote unquote natural, who are working just as non-interventionist and as organically or biodynamically as the people in the natural wine world. So why is there this artificial wall when it doesn't make any sense? And
Uh-huh.
that was one reason why I included both natural and traditional wines in the book, because there's a filter automatically for how they're working in the vineyard. I think, people say all natural wine's bad. That's a ridiculous attitude because some of it's brilliant. It's like saying, all conventional wine is bad, which is also an equally ridiculous statement. There's
Mhm.
bad wines in both realms. It's like saying all indie movies are bad or all indie movies are good or all, big commercial releases are bad or good. You can't generalize like that. But I think that what the natural wine, I had an interesting conversation with a winemaker who said, he makes, conventional wines, but he started making a line of non-intervention natural wines. And he said what it made him do was start to think about, well, what is a flaw? Like, is it a flaw just because I decided it was a flaw or because it's traditionally a flaw? Like, who decided this?
Right.
Where's the line of what a flaw is? And similarly, I talked to the owner of La Stopa, which is a really wonderful natural wine producer, and she said, we talk about flaws, but if my daughter buys a pair of $160 jeans that have rips in them,
Yeah.
she thinks she and her friends all think that she's the coolest person around because they're the designer that they're all into. On a practical level, they're flawed. They've got holes in them, but,
Right.
so there's a cultural lens that says what a flaw is, and it is not a fixed thing necessarily. It changes with generations. It changes with attitudes. So, for many years, Brett in wines was terroir. Then everybody's like, oh, this is Brett. It's a flaw. And then the natural wine people come along and they're like, no, Brett is actually a positive, and you just bounce back and forth on these things. So,
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. Well, I have a couple of rapid fire fun
yeah,
questions,
sure.
and then I want you to give people where they can go to contact you and get your
Yeah.
book and all that fun stuff. But okay, here we go. Old
Right.
world or new world?
It's hard to make a decision. I mean, I probably drink more old world than new world overall, but there are new world producers that I love, and there are old world producers that I think are utterly uninteresting. So I'd
Yeah.
say, honest versus BS is kind of where I land.
Okay. And this is maybe just now since getting into the happy hour time frame
Yeah.
on a Friday. Bubbles or still?
Oh, well, I mean, for happy hour on Friday, bubbles, you
Okay.
know,
Perfect.
yeah.
What is one wine snob behavior that drives you crazy?
Oh, I mean, I'll tell you, it started early on. It's when I went into a wine store when I was first learning about wine, and I asked for a Cabernet, and I said, but maybe one that's not too tannic. I don't think I really like tannic. The guy looked at me like I was an idiot. It was like, oh, that's something that's not too tannic, and it's that hauteur that goes with knowledge, where you, whether intentionally or unintentionally, make people who have less knowledge than you feel bad about what they're asking, and it's
Mhm.
endemic in wine, and it drives me bonkers. It's like,
Yes.
that don't reward curiosity with snobbery.
Love that. What's one wine myth that you want to dispel right now here on the sipping point?
The sulfites cause headaches. Let's dispel that one
Yeah.
right there.
Let's double down on that. It's not the
Yeah, just the hell
sulfites,
with it.
people.
Sorry, people,
Yeah.
it's not the sulfites.
Perfect. I know. Disappointing. You didn't get a headache in Europe because you were on a vacation in Europe.
Yeah,
Basically, that's where we're at. Drink more water. And also
yeah,
my little thought there too is that say in Italy or France, you're not often drinking wine without food. You're always having
yeah.
wine with food. Whereas for some reason, I think because our culture, we didn't have wine at the dinner table. We might go out for 3 glasses of wine and then you eat. Well, if you have wine on an empty stomach like that, I feel like that does set you up for more problems
It's
later.
it's a
So,
classic
yeah,
classic thing with champagne. People say, "Oh, I can't drink champagne. It gets me too drunk." And you're like, "Well, champagne's actually quite low in alcohol. What gets you drunk is drinking a bunch of champagne with no food." Because we
right.
stand around at a cocktail party drinking champagne and having like 2 crackers, and yes,
Yes.
it will get you drunk at that point.
Right. Perfect. All right. Well, if folks want to connect with you, buy your
Yeah,
book, what's the best way to get in touch?
best way to well, probably easiest is Instagram, which is Isle. I'm Ray Isle, Rayisle. I'm on Instagram frequently. I'm also in food and wine. Obviously, I'm the wine editor for the magazine. The book is available ideally at indie bookstores around the country, but it's also available on Amazon, like every other thing that we might want to buy, except for wine.
Yes, I
But
know.
but it can be got both from the the vast kingdom of Jeff Bezos, and it can be got from some wonderful independent bookstores around the country. And
Well,
yeah,
I love the title, The World in a Wine Glass. That's the way I wanna learn about the world, and I think this is a great resource for anyone looking to expand, their wine drinking portfolio, if you will, and just try new things. So thank you, Ray, so much
Lori,
for
thank you for
putting that
having me
out,
on.
and it's just been fun having you on The Sipping Point.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been great.